Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Lecture 4, The French Revolution. Today we're going to talk about the war with Austria. And here you see a nice picture of the painting of the Battle of Valmy from 1792. And what we find is that France had declared war on Austria. And part of the reason was because of the Declaration of Pillnitz, and part of the reason was because the radicals wanted to spread the revolution throughout Europe. You'll recall the Declaration of Pillnitz is the other monarchs all gathering together, and what they're saying is, we don't want this French Revolution coming to us. We want stability in Europe. We don't want our monarchs to lose our power. And remember from our previous lecture, this was the Prussian King Frederick, William III, the Austrian Emperor Leopold, and Comte d'Artois, Louis XVI's brother. So those monarchs all got together and they said, no, we can't have any of these crazy revolutionaries coming to our countries and taking over. So the whole idea of this war with Austria is to protect the monarchy. Now, this conflict is known as the War of the First Coalition, and what happened was Prussia joins Austria against France, and the wartime atmosphere in France eventually influences the revolution and spills into the streets of Paris, where mobs attack the royal family in August 1792, and they're fearful that a coalition victory, the Declaration of Pillnitz folks, the Austrians, the Prussians, and others, will be victorious and restore King Louis to power. So the mobs go after the royal family. By early 1793, Austria and Prussia have been joined by Great Britain, Holland, and Spain. And at this point, in 93, the war is going very badly for France. The National Convention decides to institute a draft called the Levy en Masse. And this draft involves the conscription of all able-bodied men between 18 and 25 into the army. And the army grows to 800,000 men by 1794. This draft, or this levy, represents the first time a massive draft of soldiers happens on the European continent. It will happen again in 100 years for World War I, and it will happen again in World War II. But this is 100 years previous. So during the 1793 to 94, France focuses on defending itself against invasion. In the following year, French troops went on the offensive and occupied the Low Countries, the Rhineland, Switzerland, and parts of Spain. The treaties of Basel in 1795 end the war with Prussia and Spain. In 1796, French armies, commanded by a young officer named Napoleon Bonaparte, invade Italy, and they win a series of small battles against Austrian troops, and they occupy strategic areas in Italy. These victories force Austria to make peace with France, and the War of the First Coalition ended in 1797. So, there you have the War of Austria. It goes from 1792 to 1797. And France loses some victories, but they win some. In the war, the First Coalition ends in 1797. So this next slide talks about the radicals taking over. And what you're seeing in this picture is a Paris mob storming Tuileries, is I believe how you say it. And that is King Louis's home in Paris. That is his castle in Paris. So King Louis and his family are going to seek safety in the Legislative Assembly, but there's not going to be too much safety there because they're arrested and deposed, or essentially put under armed guard. So meanwhile, back in August 1792, the Paris Commune, which is the governing body of the city of Paris, sort of like the Paris City Council, so the Paris Commune leads an angry mob which had been under control since Marquis de Lafayette and the National Guard had fired upon them in the previous year. Well, this mob attacks the royal family in Tulare. They kill off all the king's guards, and they force King Louis to seek refuge in the Legislative Assembly. He is taken prisoner, and the assembly votes to depose him, to get rid of him, to essentially strip him of his title and of his power. And then from this point on, in August of 1792, King Louis XVI and his queen Marie Antoinette never rule again, and they never see each other again. The Legislative Assembly calls for a new election to a national convention to draft yet another new constitution for the French Republic. I believe this is their third constitution in 3 years. And so what you see with the revolution in France is there's just a steady churn. The people who take over, the radicals, are accused of being sympathetic to the royals, and then they're executed, and then new people take over, and then they're accused of being sympathetic to the royals, so they're executed, and the war kind of turns on itself. The revolution turns on itself, and the people, it's very unstable, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So the National Convention is a new legislative body that replaces the National Assembly. They first meet on September 21st, 1792. The first act of this new government is to officially remove the king from the French government. France has declared a republic, which is where people are elected to represent the people. The National Convention also throws out the traditional Gregorian calendar in favor of a revolutionary calendar, and the year 1792 is labeled as Year 1. There are two main factions or groups that dominate the National Convention. One, the Jacobin clubs, had been radical political groups. Remember, radical is extreme, bloodthirsty, borderline crazy. These radical political groups had sprung up throughout Europe during the Revolution, and initially the Jacobins had total control of the National Convention, but they split into two factions, two groups, the Jacobins and the Girondins. Girondins, yeah, I think that's how you say it. And the Girondins represent the provinces, the country, the rural areas, outside the city. So the Girondins were soon expelled from the Jacobins because they were too moderate. They weren't as extreme enough. Maybe they didn't want to kill the royal family. Maybe they only wanted to put them in prison. So the most radical Jacobins are called the Mountain because they all sit in the highest seats in the hall where the National Convention meets. All three groups agreed that King Louis had committed treason, but only the Mountain demands his execution. So the Mountain is this radical group. They demand the king be executed. And in the next slide, we're going to see who these leaders were. On the left is Jean-Paul Marat, and on the right is Georges Danton. So one of the most prominent Jacobin leaders is Jean-Paul Marat, and he had been an early advocate of abolishing or doing away with the monarchy. He advocated for the elimination of any of the enemies of the revolution, and so he supported the September of 1792 massacres, in which 1,200 political prisoners in the jails of Paris are killed by Jacobin-supported mobs. One of the most radical members of the National Convention, Marat, Jean-Paul, strongly condemns the Girondins for being too moderate. The Girondins, in turn, see him as an increasingly dangerous demagogue or idealist, someone who just appeals to the masses. And so on July 13th, 1791, Jean-Paul Marat is stabbed to death in his bathtub by a young girl, Charlotte Corday, who is a young Girondin. And so this assassination, is another, point in showing how violent and virulent the two factions are. They hate each other so much, They send a young girl to seduce this poor guy and stab him to death in this bathtub. So another important Jacobin leader is Georges Danton. He's a member of the Commune of Paris. He helps organize the attack on the Tuileries, the King Louis XVI's Paris home, and he overthrows the monarchy. He's a key figure in that. In this new republic, he becomes the Minister of Justice. And as a member of the National Convention, he dominated what's called the First Committee of Public Safety, which is what we call an ironic title, because the Committee of Public Safety essentially starts these witch hunts looking for the prisoners or looking for the traitors of France, and what they do is they execute these traitors without putting them on trial. So next we're going to talk about Maximilien Robespierre, and Robespierre is again a radical Jacobin. He is probably the most controversial figure of the French Revolution. He is a country lawyer, and he comes to symbolize the fanaticism, the craziness, the idolatry of the French Revolution. And so first he's a member of the National Convention, and then he becomes the head of the Committee of Public Safety. So his job, he seeks to have all of the ideals of the revolution enforced, and in doing so he perverts these ideals. He kind of twists them. So, and so many of these people with them had struggled to attain these. So using his own words, he says, quote, "To establish and consolidate democracy, to achieve the peaceful rule of constitutional laws, we must finish the war of liberty against tyranny. We must annihilate the enemies of the Republic at home and abroad, or else we will perish." So what Robespierre is essentially saying is, we may have to kill everybody to achieve peace. We'll never have freedom until all of the enemies of freedom are dead. So, and the Committee for Public Safety kills a lot of people, thousands and thousands of people over the next few years. And the way they do it is with this new invention called the guillotine. The guillotine is named after its inventor, Joseph Guillotine. It's supposed to be a more humane method of execution, and thousands of people are guillotined instead of hung during the French Revolution. So in October of 1789, Dr. Joseph Guillotine proposes to the National Assembly that those condemned to death should be beheaded rather than hung, burned, or drawn and quartered. And when you draw and quarter someone, essentially you're tying all of their limbs to horses, and you're whipping the horses until the horses pull them apart in all four directions. So, granted, that kills people, but it's excruciatingly painful and a humiliating way to die. So, Guillotine argues beheading is quicker and more humane, and adopting a uniform method of execution is more democratic. So in 1791, the Assembly agrees, and they make the guillotine the official method of execution. The guillotine's first used in 1792, and the crowd that gathered the new machine to watch it disliked it because the death occurred too quickly. They preferred hanging, they preferred the gallows, but during the course of the Revolution, thousands died by the guillotine. At the height of its use in the city of Paris, over 1,200 people are executed in the 13-month period from May 1793 to June 1794. So, Committee of Public Safety, not really making the public safe. The guillotine, executing thousands of people without trial. And here we'll talk next about the Reign of Terror, but this is where the French Revolution sort of turns on itself and becomes its own worst enemy. Again, thank you for listening. Please review your notes, review the reading, and good luck on the quiz tomorrow.